Here to join us this morning, first up is Kara Alaimo, PhD, a global public relations consultant, trainer, and professor at Hofstra University, and author of Pitch, Tweet, or Engage, How to Practice Global Public Relations and Strategic Communications. Please join us in welcoming Kara for her session, Going Global, Adapting PR Strategies for Different Countries and Cultures.
Thank you. Good morning. Today I am going to share information from my new book, Pitch, Tweet, or Engage on the Street, How to Practice Global Public Relations and Strategic Communication. The book was published by Routledge in August, and I wrote this book because it provides the resource that I wanted, that I was looking for when I was a global communicator at the United Nations and in the Obama administration. And in those positions, I was searching for a guide that would tell me, how do I adapt my public relations strategy for Russia? What should I do when I'm communicating in Nigeria, and what should I not do when I'm practicing PR in China? And that's the guide that this book provides. By the way, I'm happy for this event to be, for my talk, to be on the record, and my Twitter handle is @Kara_Alaimo if you'd like to tweet any of this. So I was first inspired to write this book in my very first position at the United Nations. I was a global media coordinator, and I coordinated a team of communicators around the world who were promoting the Millennium Development Goals, which was the world's current plan for ending global poverty at the time. And every other week, I would organize a conference call on which I would ask our communications team around the world to send me material for our global communications campaigns by particular deadlines. And invariably, my colleagues would say yes to my requests, and then the deadline would come, and I wouldn't have the information that I thought that they had agreed to send me. Finally, my boss, who was from South Africa, had to sit me down and explain to me that in many cultures, it is rude to say no. And therefore, my colleagues would say yes to anything I ever asked of them, regardless of whether they had any intention of ever delivering. That was my first clue that I needed to get savvy about cross-cultural communication if I was going to succeed in the world of global public relations. My book provides a guide for how to practice public relations around the world, and as part of my research for the book, I conducted interviews with senior PR practitioners in 31 countries. I did focus groups in person in South Africa and in Brazil. I did interviews here in New York at the Social Media Strategies Summit. I interviewed a lot of practitioners at the World Communication Forum in Davos, and I did dozens and dozens of interviews on Skype with practitioners around the world. My book breaks the world down into 10 different cultural clusters that were identified by other researchers as part of the GLOBE study, which was a 10-year study done by about 170 researchers around the world. And in today's presentation, I'm going to give you a quick tour of the world and talk about some of the PR strategies that work best in each of these cultural groups around the world. Now, I promise not to be too professorial today, but I want to just take a minute to tell you one thing about theory, which is, if you've ever taken a course in international public relations, for the past couple of decades, professors have been teaching something called the generic specific approach to international public relations. And according to this theory, if you're going to practice PR in a new country or culture, you need to take account of 5 local factors. And that's the political economic system, the local culture, the extent of activism locally, the level of economic development, and the media system in the country. In my book, I add 2 additional dimensions to this theory. The first thing that I talk about is the need to understand local social expectations when communicating in a new country or culture. One of the people who I interviewed for the book was the head of communications for GE in Latin America. And he told me that if you are working in a new community in the Amazon, and that community needs a road or a school built, they will ask you to build that road or that school, regardless of whether you have any expertise in this area. And he said, make no mistake, that doesn't mean that they trust you. It just means that you're there and you have the capacity to do it. So that's really important because you need to understand local social expectations before you begin practicing PR or working in a new community so that you can understand how you will be judged by local communities. And that varies very significantly in countries and cultures around the world. The second dimension that I add is the concept of local influencers. So here in the United States, does anyone know what the main sources of information that go on to trend on Twitter might be? Who writes the stories that trend on Twitter? It's not Justin Bieber. Any other guesses? I'm sorry? Kim Kardashian. No, not Kim either. Anyone? So it's the New York Times, CNN, and ESPN. By contrast, in China, people don't trust the traditional media because they know that it's censored by the government. And so the people who are influential on social media in China are local influencers, like artists, professors, and independent journalists who've garnered reputations over time for sharing information that turns out to actually be true. And so it's really important when working in a new country or culture to figure out who's influential locally and try to get those people to evangelize for you. And I think the practitioners who I found to be most strategic in this regard were in South Africa. And that's probably because South Africa has 11 official languages. It's an incredibly diverse country. And so there isn't one or two PR strategies that work well for the entire country. You really have to segment your audiences. And what I found is that practitioners there will find the cool kid in a particular township who may have no money, but he or she has local influence, has influence on how other people think and buy in that community. And so I think it's really important to think strategically about who those local people are. Maybe they're Hollywood celebrities, maybe they're Bollywood celebrities, but in many parts of the world, it's imams and the village chiefs. So I'd like to take you on a quick tour of the world right now, and before I do, I'll give you just two caveats. I'm going to talk about PR strategies that work well in particular cultures. And one thing I'd say is that, to some degree, these recommendations have to be stereotypes because it's almost all we have to understand cultural differences. This is controversial, and some scholars argue that the differences between people of the same culture are greater than the differences between people of different cultures. But I've found that these tools are the best advice that we can get for how to practice public relations in different countries and cultures. Second caveat is do not try to do this on your own. You absolutely need help from local practitioners on the ground if you're going to go start working in a country or culture that is foreign to you. With that said, here are some of the practices that the practitioners around the world who I interviewed told me work best in different countries and cultures. So we'll start with Asia. In Asia, PR practitioners practice what professors call the personal influence model of public relations. Was anyone awake in class that day? Does anyone know what that is? Any guesses? So the personal influence model essentially says that the best way to achieve your goals is to make friends with locals, and that includes reporters, it includes government officials, and other stakeholders, and it's all about personal relationships. So you can't just fly to China and call a reporter you've never done business with before and expect that reporter to write a story today. It's all about building relationships over time. Asia is also a collectivist culture. So the United States is the most individualistic culture on earth, and it's almost hard for me as an American to fully wrap my head around this. But in a collectivist culture, by contrast, people conceive of themselves as members of a group rather than as individuals, as they would in an individualistic culture. And because of that, a lot of your messages should focus on group benefits, should focus on the benefits to, for example, the whole family. A great example of a cultural adaptation that worked well in China was Coca-Cola's Share a Coke campaign. Does everyone remember this? So in individualistic countries like the United States, Australia, and the UK, Coke printed individual people's first names on Coke bottles. In collectivist cultures like China and Japan, they adapted their strategy. So in Japan, for example, they printed codes that would allow people to download Sony music, since the Japanese are very proud of Sony, which is a homegrown company, and share that music with their friends. In China, they printed popular nicknames and quotes from movies. So that's a great example of how you apply an individualistic approach in individualistic cultures and a collectivist approach in other cultures as part of a global campaign that was nevertheless very coherent. Another big concept to be aware of when practicing PR in Asia is the concept of face. Does anyone know what this is? So here in the United States, you try to not embarrass yourself in social situations. In Asia, the concept of face means that you also would never want to put another person in a position to be embarrassed. And that has huge implications for how you conduct yourself in a business meeting, for how you write many of your messages in this region. Asians are also high context communicators. So in the United States, we tend to be low context communicators. If I want something done, I am going to say so directly and bluntly and clearly. In a high context culture, you have to pick up on other nuances. You have to pick up on body language and on things that are left unsaid to understand the true meaning of what people are trying to convey. And that's really another reason why you need help from local practitioners to explain things. Asians also have long-term orientation. So whereas here in the United States, Americans might buy things on their credit card and figure that they'll pay for them later, in Asia, people save their money for old age and focus on long-term benefits rather than short-term rewards. So that has huge implications for how we craft our messages. Asians are also high in what cultural researchers call power distance, essentially hierarchy. And what that means is that if you are the most junior person in the room and you have a good idea, you may not speak up in a meeting because the boss is right, whether or not you think the boss is really right. And so when you're working as part of a multicultural team, it sometimes takes some extra effort to ensure that everyone in the room is going to share their ideas. And I talk about strategies for managing a global team in a different chapter of the book. Finally, so Asia has two different cultural clusters. There's South Asia, which is sort of a little bit more comfortable with individualism. These are cultures like India and Indonesia. And then there's Confucian Asia, which has been influenced by the tradition of Confucianism, so China, Japan, South Korea, those countries. And in Confucian Asia, in particular, there's this concept that scholars call risky communication. And essentially what this means is that Confucian tradition teaches people from a very young age that the best thing to do if you have a problem is to not tell anyone, because talking about a problem creates more problems. And this becomes a huge challenge if you're a practitioner who has to convince an organization in this part of the world to be transparent. So an example would be the Sanlu Dairy Corp. Does everyone remember this company? They were a huge manufacturer of infant formula in China, and just before the 2008 Olympics, they discovered that their formula was poisoned, and if infants consumed this formula, they would die. So the company decided to quietly pull the product from store shelves, but not to tell anyone. So the parents who'd already purchased the formula went on to feed it to their infants, who in fact died. Now, happily, Sanlu is now out of business, but it just goes to show that this mentality really does still persist. Last but not least, the average commute in Asia is an hour, and a lot of people spend that time on mobile phones, so mobile strategies can be hugely effective in Asia. Let's now go to the Middle East and North Africa. So you may be familiar with the concept of the youth bulge. More than half of the population of the Middle East and North Africa is under the age of 25 right now. And there's huge issues with youth unemployment, but what this also means is that you're probably talking to youthful audiences in this part of the world. Religion is a factor that is huge in this part of the world, and so when I talk about this region, I'm going to talk about the Arab cultural cluster. Israel also falls within this region. That actually falls under the Latin European cultural cluster, which I'll talk about when we go to Europe. But in the United States, most practitioners will tell you not to talk about religion, that religious appeals just sort of don't work in PR campaigns. The opposite is true in the Arab cultural cluster, but only if they feel authentic. And again, that's where you need help from local practitioners. The weekend is Friday and Saturday in the Middle East, so be aware of this if you are working in this part of the world. The personal influence model, with which you're now familiar, is definitely practiced in this region, so it's all about who you know and building relationships over time. Arabs also have a very heightened sense of pride, and so here again in this culture, you'd never want to put someone in a position to be publicly embarrassed. However, whereas in Confucian Asia, you would never publicly humiliate or praise a person, in the Arab world, it is absolutely acceptable to give public praise, just not criticism. There's a sense among cultural researchers that although things are changing now that the population is more youthful, there is overall more of a present orientation in the Arab world, and you have to work a little bit harder in this region to communicate messages when you're trying to convince people to change. One of the most important factors to be aware of in the Arab world, though, is the concept of emotion. And so here in the United States, if I were to do a media interview and a reporter asked me a tough question or a heated question, and I got visibly angry or I started screaming at the reporter, people would think that I was unhinged. In the Arab world, the opposite is true. Emotional responses are expected to emotional questions, and if you don't demonstrate emotion, people will not trust you. So this is another reason why you really, really need local practitioners to be doing those types of interviews for you. Another concept is this sort of symbolism that infuses the Arabic language, and I would recommend the scholar R.S. Zaharna at American University on this subject, but basically what she talks about is the fact that the English language evolved to convey facts that are truthful. The Arabic language originally evolved orally rather than being a written language. It evolved as a means of promoting nationalism and religion. And because of that, she says what's often most important is symbolism rather than complete factual accuracy. And that's what causes some of the confusion when people from the West, for example, feel that certain messages are hyperbolic or are exaggerated. Last but not least, practitioners in this part of the world will tell you that a lot of organizations come to Dubai or wherever they're doing their regional campaigns, and they bring their messages to be translated into Arabic. And the problem is that English and Arabic and other languages don't translate literally. And so if I were to take a passage from Arabic and try to translate it into English, I would have run-on sentences with lots of punctuation in between. It just sort of doesn't work. And so practitioners will tell you that the best thing to do is actually to write your messages in Arabic from the start, is to get a local practitioner who can do that for you. We'll now skip to Latin America. So this is Mexico, Central and South America, the part of the world where predominantly Spanish and Portuguese are spoken. So Latin America is very collectivist, but unlike Confucian Asia, for example, Latin Americans are collectivist around the family as opposed to other groups in society like your work group. The personal influence model, with which you're now familiar, is definitely practiced in Latin America. Latin Americans also have what's called a polychronic approach to time. Does anyone know what this is? So I have this great quote in my book from a practitioner who says that if we say, let's start on Monday at 10 a.m., in the United States or in New York, at 10:05 a.m., you are late. At 10:05 a.m. in Brazil, a week later, you're just getting talking. There's just a much more relaxed and fluid approach to time. One of my former students worked for Burst and Marsteller in Ecuador, and she said that executives at Burson in Miami came up with a global campaign to promote a new Sony product. When they had to launch it in Ecuador, they decided that instead of doing a press conference that started at a particular time, they would do an all-day open house so that regardless of when reporters showed up, they could still participate. That's a great cultural adaptation. Latin Americans have a low future orientation. What that means is that they live in the present. They work to live rather than the other way around, and they enjoy life. And that definitely impacts how you want to craft your messages in this part of the world. Poverty and inequality are a huge issue here, as in other parts of the world, but what's interesting is how this plays out on social media. And so the chief reputation officer for Weber Shandwick told me that she learned when she went to Brazil that a lot of executives will not allow you to post their pictures on your website or on social media channels because they're afraid of becoming the victims of crime. Another one of my former students who worked for JP Morgan said that Latin America is the one country in the world, or the one region in the world, where JP does not post the photos of their senior executives either. So something to be aware of. As I mentioned, there's this expectation in Latin America that businesses will help society. And so again, you want to be aware of local social expectations before you start operating or running a PR campaign here. Finally, there's a sense that Latin America is experiencing what the president of Hill & Knowlton in Chile told me is a citizen moment. Citizens are starting to talk back. They're starting to demand answers from government and from corporations about how they're improving society. And so this woman told me that when she does a PR campaign in Chile, she always tries to answer the question of how her company's presence in the country benefits Mrs. Juanita, which is essentially the Jane Doe of Chile. Next is sub-Saharan Africa. And in sub-Saharan Africa, when you work with reporters, they will often expect you to provide brown envelopes in exchange for media coverage. Does anyone know what goes in a brown envelope? Exactly, cash. And this may sound diabolical, but it is also true that, with the exception of South Africa, really, the reason that brown envelopes are so common in sub-Saharan Africa is because many reporters, in some instances, are not paid at all for their stories. The only way that they make money is through their sources. And in other situations, they're just grossly underpaid. And so in the book, I talk about strategies for overcoming this. When I worked at the UN and in the Obama administration, we obviously would not provide brown envelopes, which, by the way, are red in China. But we wouldn't provide brown envelopes, but what you can do is provide meals at press briefings and at events. I once traveled to Togo in Africa with the Deputy Treasury Secretary of the United States who spoke to Parliament. And our embassy's communication officer actually drove around the capital city of Lomé in a van, picking up reporters to come to the speech, because otherwise they would have had no way of getting there. So that's another thing you can do, is to provide transportation. Corporate social responsibility is hugely important in sub-Saharan Africa. This region has what cultural researchers call high humane orientation, which means that people care about one another. Word of mouth is also huge in sub-Saharan Africa. I have a great quote in my book that in a Western city, it's often possible to leave work, take public transportation across town, pick up dinner, and go home without ever speaking to another human being. This would be practically impossible in sub-Saharan Africa. People talk to each other. They talk to the person sitting next to you on the bus. And so word of mouth strategies can be very effective in this part of the world. Sub-Saharan Africans are high context communicators. Again, you have to pick up on the more nuanced meaning of what people are telling you. Indigenous forms of outreach can also be very effective in sub-Saharan Africa. So that could be something like staging plays or theatrical productions in different communities in this region. And last but not least, relationships, the personal influence model, are essentially everything in this part of the world. Our last part of the world is Europe, and Europe is complicated because there are 5 different cultural clusters in this region, and so I'm just going to give you one quick fact from each of them. The first cultural cluster is Anglo-Europe, so this is the United Kingdom, but this would also include the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And in the UK in particular, you really want to be prepared for skepticism from both audiences and also reporters. So here in the US, if I were to set up a media interview, I would expect tough questions. But in the UK, if a reporter is going to interview a CEO, that reporter will truly grill an executive, and it will become contentious in a way that is socially acceptable in the UK, but would be unexpected in the US. Reporters just ask tougher questions, and you have to be prepared for that. Latin Europe includes France, Italy, and Spain. And in Italy, there is a local saying that Italy is the land of 1,000 bell towers. And what that means is that Italy is oriented around local provinces. So whereas in certain countries like Japan or South Korea, there's a few big national newspapers that everyone reads. In Italy, if you want to reach local people, you've got to go to the regional papers and regional media. Germanic Europe includes Germany, the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and Austria. And in Germany, privacy is absolutely critical, and there are very strict privacy laws. So that means that you would never add a reporter to a distribution list and just start blasting that reporter with press releases without asking for the reporter's permission first. And you always want to explain to audiences, if you're collecting information, why it's necessary for you to have that information. Nordic Europe includes Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And in Nordic Europe, the most important factor to take into account is the demand for transparency. Is anyone familiar with @Sweden, the official Twitter handle of the country of Sweden? Does anyone know how it works? Exactly. So the government, I'm not making this up, turns the Twitter handle over to a different Swedish person every week to tweet whatever they want unfiltered. Now, people have tweeted about childbirth, people have tweeted anti-Semitic comments, people have tweeted bizarre comments that I would not repeat on this stage. And when the government is asked, why do you allow people to post these things? That reflects terribly on your country. They tell reporters censorship would be inappropriate in our culture. And so it's incredibly important to be transparent in this part of the world. It's expected, and if you aren't, people will not forgive you. Last but not least is Eastern Europe, which includes Russia and Eastern European countries. And in Russia, people talk about black PR and white PR. Does anyone know the difference? So black PR is considered to be things like manipulation and deceit. Typically, you hear about this within the context of political campaigns in Russia. Now, many scholars would argue that black PR is not actually PR at all, but that's a distinction that is drawn, and then white PR is supposed to be the ethical kind, which is what I would just call plain old public relations. So that's what I wanted to share with you. If you'd like to hear more, I've posted a discount code. You can get 20% off the book and free shipping on my publisher's website, which is routledge.com, using the promo code FLR40. I've also posted my Twitter handle and contact information if you'd like to be in touch in the future. But for now, I would love to take your questions if you'd like to come up to the mic. Anyone? Come through. Come on up. Hi.
I was curious, you talked a lot about Latin America, and we've had an initiative at the agency to target Hispanics in the US. And the research that we've come across has been fragmented, whether it's Latin America, it's Hispanics, it's, you know, sort of all over the board. So how, based on what you put up here about Latin America, how does that change for when you're looking at like the big, like diverse population of Hispanics in the US?
So I would draw a distinction between immigrants who've come to the US from other countries and the Hispanic community that may have been born in the United States. Same thing with, the distinction between African Americans in the United States and people who have come to the United States from Africa. These groups have almost nothing in common, and you'd message very differently. So I think it depends on who you're targeting. The information that I shared can be very helpful if you're targeting immigrant groups who've come recently from Latin America. But otherwise, I think you absolutely have to do research and look at Hispanic populations in the United States, which are very diverse, and look at the particular community you're targeting and best practices in the United States. And I think that's sort of an important point because you shouldn't confuse a country with a culture, which is something that I think a lot of us can be guilty of. But with the exceptions of a few countries that are monolithic, like Japan and South Korea, most countries are composed of a ton of different cultures. And so you really, really have to narrowly segment your audiences. Other questions?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Quick comment. Interesting. I've done a lot of work internationally in my career. And I agree with a lot of it, that, a lot of it is changing rapidly, and with the world becoming more integrated, a lot of these cultural assumptions are breaking down. I did work in Japan and China and other places. And there's as many people there that practice public relations the way we do as don't. But there's a lot in what you're saying, and I think if you're going to practice internationally, you certainly have to be sensitive to the cultural values and how people practice. I want to make one comment you suggested about getting PR firms in other countries when you're working. The issue of translation, and I had an agency for years, and we used to work in 5 countries for a particular client. Everything we did in English, we would have translated, here by native speakers and linguists, and send it to the clients. And we were doing this for a year, and one day we had a meeting with all of the organizations from around the world that were involved with this client, and we said, any questions? And someone said, well, who does the news releases? And we said, we do, but the people that do them are from the countries, been here 3 or 4 months. And they said, well, they're okay translated, but there's something missing. And what we found out, and it released us the burden of writing it, is we needed to hire writers in the countries to take what we wrote or what was written for those countries. People that had the notion of how to write for public relations, marketing, and advertising purposes, who knew how to put the pizzazz and the zing and do it the way, let's say, we would do it in America for the stuff we wrote. It was a really profound shift in how we looked at this. So if you do anything with translation, I know there are translation services and all the rest, but if you're going to do public relations, marketing, advertising, hire somebody in those countries that knows PR, advertising, and marketing, and can convey it in a way that the people there will expect and understand.
I agree, and I'd make 2 other points on translation. The first is that if you have material translated, you always want to have a back translation done. Does anyone know what that is? So if I have material translated from English into Spanish, I'm going to hire a different translation company to back translate the Spanish version back into English to tell me what I'm actually telling people. And you would be surprised what you find. So one of the stories I tell in my book is from R.P. Kumar, who's now an EVP at Ketchum. And he wrote a tagline to promote a laundry detergent in India. He wrote it in Hindi, promising extra lather, extra power. He had the tagline translated into local languages in India, and when the back translations came back, they promised extra lather, extra powder. But there wasn't any extra powder in this product, and he said that if they had run with these translations, it would have been illegal and the entire agency would have been fired. So back translations are your friend. And the other thing to be aware of is that some concepts simply cannot translate. And so before you come up with a brand name or with a global message, you want to make sure that it can in fact translate into different languages that you're going to be operating in. I once came up with this concept of a GPS as a metaphor when I was working at the United Nations. The concept of a GPS does not translate in French. It just doesn't work. And so that killed the whole idea because one official language wouldn't work. So that's another thing to keep in mind before you agree on any messaging. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Yes.
hi. I think we all know in the United States, influencers are highly regulated with, disclaimers and what they have to, what they have to write at the end of the post, and is it sponsor, is it ad, blah, 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 whatever. In other regions, are influencers similarly regulated and scrutinized?
That's an easy answer. No. So one group that hosted my focus group in Cape Town, really cool PR firm called the Amplicon Group. They work with local influencers, and one of their clients is a large property developer that builds luxury apartments in Cape Town. Now in South Africa, the perception is that the best schools are in the suburbs. And so if you're affluent, you're not gonna wanna send your kids to schools in the city. So what the Amplicon Group did is they started writing blogs about the benefits of city living, how great the schools were, how great the lifestyle was. In many cases, they didn't mention their client. Sometimes they in fact mentioned the competition. The point wasn't to promote the property developer, it was to change mindsets about city living. And they gave this content that they wrote to influencers to post. Now we know here in the United States that the PRSA Code of Ethics tells us that you have to disclose the source of information. Well, that wasn't done. And I said to the folks at the Amplicon Group, what did you pay these influencers to post this content for you? And they said to me, absolutely nothing, because if you're an influencer, what do you want more than anything? Cool content that people are going to enjoy, because that's how you stay influential. That's how you keep your followers and your friends, right? And so I thought this was an incredibly interesting concept, and I think that we in the United States have a lot to learn from how South Africans, for example, approach influencer engagement, because they do it at a much more grassroots level, and they really get to the people who actually have influence in particular communities. And I think that's fascinating and a really promising strategy for us here. But I also think that there are a lot of ethical questions that we have to work through in terms of disclosing sources, and that definitely isn't done in a lot of other places.